Okay, welcome everyone to a really brief lab that we're going to do today. So this is for section D in your handout. Now you'll notice in section D that there's a table, and in the first column there's sample number 1 and sample number 2. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at two different samples of minerals, and we're going to get an idea or try to use the properties that we can use to describe minerals in order to figure out what these minerals might be. So you'll notice as well in section D in the instructions, there's a link to a mineral identification guide. So make sure you have that open in order to help you answer this part as well. So I have two samples here. So I'm going to show you each one first. So this is going to be sample number 1. You can take a brief look at it here. And then I have sample number 2. Now, as you know from your textbook, right? There are a few different ways that we can classify minerals, or ways that we can describe them, different properties that we can use. So the first one that we can use is color, right? And color is probably the easiest way to describe a mineral. So for example, if we look at this one, this mineral, it looks pretty dark, almost mostly black and gray, until you look even closer. And then you can start to see that there's a little bit of a tinge of kind of a red or an orange in there, right? So make sure you make note of that in your observations. In sample number 2, well, it's mostly white, right? Maybe a little bit of an off-white, kind of a beigey color. There's some spots where it's a little bit darker gray, but for the most part, it's mostly white or kind of an off-white beige color. Now, another way that we can describe them is based on what we call their luster. Okay, now luster oftentimes can be described as something as simple as either shiny or not shiny, but really more technically, it's looking at its appearance, especially in comparison to metals, or does it look metallic? So we can describe a luster based on either it's metallic looking, right? So it looks like it's actually metal. It looks glassy, or what's called vitreous, or we can just say that it's non-metallic, right? Or sometimes people will say earthy, right? So if I'm looking at this sample here, sample number 1, right? There's not a ton of this sample in particular does not have very much luster, so it might be described as earthy. You'll notice it just looks earthy. It looks just kind of like, almost like it's just a regular rock you pick up off the ground. However, when I look at sample number 2, you notice as I move it around, it'll reflect light a little bit, right? Now it doesn't reflect light like you might think metal would, right? It reflects light more so like glass. So this is something we would describe usually as vitreous. Now, a couple of other ways that we can, try to describe the properties of a mineral is its streak as well as its hardness, okay? Now, hardness will be determined based on what you can scratch it with, or how easily it is scratched that it will, have bits fall off, okay? So that's anywhere from 1 to, and going up into where it's harder, right? So 1 is where it is quite soft, and as you move up the scale, it's getting harder and harder. So the way that I'm going to show that is I'm actually going to scratch each of these with a coin, okay? Now it's hard because you're not going to be able to see the powder, what's left over, right? You'll have to rely on me to describe on how easily it is scratched, right? Which is its hardness, okay? But I'm going to do it over this little piece of shale in order to hopefully show you what is scratched off, because that's a good indicator of its streak. Okay, its streak, as you know in your textbook, is when you drag it across, a sample, for example, like this, and you drag it across and see what streak is left behind and what color is that streak. However, you should be doing it over what's called a streak plate, which is a porcelain plate, and I don't have one, so we're going to rely on what's left after I scratch it with this coin. So let's start with sample number 1. So when I scratch it with this coin, it's not easy to scratch, but it's not hard either, right? So it's going to be somewhere around the middle of our scale, right? So likely a 5 or a 6, okay? Now, obviously it's going to be different for each sample of a mineral, but this one in particular, it's going to be about a 5 or a 6. Now, if I show you against my shale, you can see there's a little bit of dark powder left behind, okay? So it's kind of a dark red color. Now what I can do is on this shale, it shows up quite well. If I scratch or leave a streak with my sample number 1, you can see that it's quite red, which is really significant for this sample. Now, what if I brush that off, and then I do the same thing for sample number 2? I'm going to scratch it. Now this is much easier to scratch, much easier to break apart. Okay, so this is going to be closer to a 2 or a 3 on our scale of hardness. And then if I show you, well, what color is the color of that powder? Well, it's white, right? Just like what the color of the rock itself is. So with those things in mind, I want you to take a look at the mineral identification chart that's attached to the instructions and see if you can determine what the name is of each of these samples. So sample number 1 and sample number 2. Okay, I'll tell you these at the end of the week. There's no right or wrong answer for your guess for what it's called, but I need you to, establish which mineral you think it is based on the observations that we just made.